Welcome to Biology Minds. Today we're going to talk about the skeletal system. Skeletal system consists of a couple of chapters. We start with just talking about the osseous tissue or the bone tissue, and then we move on to the different anatomical parts of the skeletal system. So, skeletal system consists of bones, obviously, but it also consists of the cartilage, the ligaments, and the connective tissue that are associated with the bones. Functions: support, storage of minerals. Specifically, we talk about calcium, but also lipids, yellow bone marrow, um, blood cell production that's in your red bone marrow, protection, and of course leverage for motion. Bones are classified by a number of ways. One is shape, internal tissue organization, and then also based on the bone markings, the features that are on the surface that make that bone different from the next bone. There are 6 bone shapes. We have sutural bones, which we find in the skull. Regular bones, short bones, flat bones, long bones, sesamoid bones. So sutural bones in the skull. We see irregular bones in the vertebrae or in the spine. Short bones, typically we see those in the wrist. Those are your carpal bones. Flat bones in the skull as well. Long bones in your femur, in your humerus, and then sesamoid bones. In this example talks about the kneecap. So short bones, small and thick. Flat bones, thin with parallel surfaces. You have long bones, which are long and thin. Sesamoid bones are small and flat. They develop inside tendons. So that's kind of the difference between just a regular bone or a flat bone and a sesamoid bone. You have bone markings, which are depressions or grooves, elevations and projections. You have tunnels. So with each bone, it has its different features to it. It has its bumps, its grooves, its projections. It has its holes in it, and these are all called bone markings. You have elevations and projections, which are either going to be considered a process, meaning a projection or a bump. You have a ramus or rami, which are going to be extensions of a bone that form an angle. Any openings, we typically either call them a sinus, which is going to be a chamber. A foramen is usually a large hole. A fissure is a deep furrow. You have a meatus, which is kind of like a channel or a passageway. And then you have canals, which are also like channels. On long bones, we see that we have depressions. Call them a narrow groove is going to be a sulcus. A shallow depression is going to be a fossa. And you have trochanters or large rough projections. You have a crest, which is like a ridge. A spine is a pointed process. A line is a low ridge. Tubercle is a small rounded projection. And then a tuberosity is a rough projection. You have different parts of specifically long bones when we're talking about them. You have a head, you have a neck, you're going to have a fossa, which is a flat area where it's going to articulate or move along with another bone, and a condyle is a smooth rounded area where that bone can move along it, the next bone. And then on long bones we have these different parts. So on a long bone you're going to have these heads on each side, which are our epiphyses. This is an epiphysis. And then you have the shaft, which is the diaphysis. And then you have this in-between portions right here and here, and we call that the metaphysis. This is where we see our epiphyseal plates. Sometimes called growth plates. And that's how your doctor can look at your x-rays and see if you still have room to grow, if you're still going to get a little bit taller. Once again, epiphysis, on both ends. You have your shaft, which is your diaphysis, and then you have this area, which is your metaphysis. So osseous tissue, it's dense, supportive tissue, contains specialized cells within it, and it produces solid matrix of calcium salt deposits. So that's why salt is or calcium is so important for your bones. Okay, it's really the matrix that makes up the bones around these collagen fibers. So once again, we saw collagen fiber in the integumentary system, and now we're seeing it in the osseous tissue. And it's a dense matrix of these calcium salts. Osteocytes are the bone cells that we see in them, contain lacunae, which are organized around blood vessels, and then canaliculi form pathways for blood vessels, exchange nutrients and wastes within that blood bone tissue. Around the bones, you're going to have this covering called a periosteum. It covers the surface of the bone, consists of this outer fibrous and inner cellular layers. And bone matrix, 2/3 of the bone matrix is calcium phosphate, and it reacts with calcium hydroxide to form crystals of hydroxyapatite, and this hydroxyapatite is very strong. All right, this is actually what is in teeth enamel, which makes your teeth very, very strong, and that's why forensic investigators, even when most of the bones are gone, your teeth are still going to be there because the teeth are high in this stuff called hydroxyapatite, this mineral that is very hard, very strong, and it is a calcium mineral. So once again, that's why we need that calcium. 1/3 of bone matrix is protein fibers. Once again, we see that calcium, or that collagen, excuse me. So calcium and collagen play a major part. We have different types of bone cells. We have kind of like the regular bone cells, which are the osteocytes. Then you have the builders, which are going to be the osteoblasts, which are going to make sure that we're building new cells. Then you're going to have these kind of cells that are going to become the different types of bone cells, which are called the osteoprogenitor cells, and then you have the osteoclasts that are going to break down old bone cells that we don't really want around anymore. These are the different types. Osteocytes, like I said, mature bone cells. They're like the regular bone cells, and then we really need them in order to maintain that bone tissue. You have the bone builders, which are osteoblasts, and then the bone, they call them recyclers here, but they're there to break down any old bone cells that we don't want. So we have the builders, and we have the demolition crew, which is our osteoclasts. And if more breakdown or more recycling goes on than building, then we see that bones become weak. Exercise, particularly weight-bearing exercise, causes osteoblasts to build bones. So people that are very active, they're going to have strong bones. People that are not so active, like grandma, we're going to see that they have weak bones. So beyond the fact that grandma might have, it's possible that grandma could get osteoporosis, she also has to make sure that she's exercising, because even without osteoporosis, her bones can get weak because she's not really working out. She's not doing any weight-bearing exercises, and those bones get weak. Bones are going to react to what the stresses that that is put on them. If no stress is put on them, then they're not really going to look to constantly build that new bone. So osteon is the basic unit of bone. It's made up of those osteocytes, which are arranged into concentric lamellae, which look like concentric circles around a central canal, which contains blood vessels. We have perforating canals. They're perpendicular to the central canal, and they carry blood vessels into bone and marrow. So you have these central canals in the concentric circles, and then perpendicular to them, you have these perforating canals, which are going to run in and out of the bone to supply the bone marrow with nutrients. Circumferential lamellae, they're wrapped around the long bone, and they bind osteons together. This right here shows you a cross section of osteon of bone that has these concentric circles, these osteons. So this is right here is an osteon. This is an osteon, and you have lamellae within them, and then you have this central canal, which contains blood vessels. In spongy bone, we have kind of a different matrix or a different build to it. So here we have our hard bone here, and then this is the spongy bone, which is going to have this kind of webbing effect, and this webbing is called trabeculae. Here this just shows you how you have your central canal with the blood vessels in it. This is just a cross section of a single osteon. Obviously, these osteons are going to be next to each other and build that hard bone. Within that, you have an inner lining, which is a endosteum. You have collagen fibers oriented to help strengthen that tissue. Spongy bone does not have osteons. It has these trabeculae. Okay, no blood vessels within there, and the space between the trabeculae is filled with red bone marrow, which has blood vessels, and it forms red blood cells. That's very important. Yellow bone marrow, it's in some bones. Spongy bone holds the yellow bone marrow, and yellow bone marrow helps to store fat and lipids, fat or lipids. Trabeculae of spongy bone. Like I said, it's this webbing effect. This is what it looks like in that spongy bone. This matrix right here is the trabeculae. Weight-bearing bones, like I said, the more weight you're going to put on them, the more that those osteoblasts are going to build in order to keep that bone strong. So as you apply pressure to a bone, all right, say a lot of weight is going down this way, and it's adding stress to here, and it's adding stress to here, it's going to continue to make sure that it's getting rid of any old cells that we don't want. That's where our osteoclasts are going to break down, and our osteoblasts are constantly going to be building. Okay, if it really is getting a lot of tension in this area, it's going to continue to keep building here, building here, building here, and making that as strong as possible. So weight-bearing exercises are very important. Periosteum is on the outside. This shows you the periosteum, the coating around bones. Bone development starts in the womb, and then it continues until age 25. It actually continues in the skull. It continues up until 50, where the bones in the skull are continuing to fuse together. Osteogenesis is the vocab word we use for bone formation. Ossification is the process of replacing other tissues with bones. Calcification is the process of depositing these calcium salts. And ossification has two main forms. You have endochondral ossification and then intramembranous ossification. Endochondral ossifies bones that originate as hyaline cartilage. So we have this hyaline cartilage kind of scaffolding, and then we build bone off of that scaffolding. As the first step of endochondral ossification, the cartilage enlarges, the chondrocytes or the cartilage cells near the center of the shaft increase greatly in size, and the matrix is reduced to a series of small struts that soon begin to calcify. That bone is starting to form. Blood vessels grow around the edges of the cartilage as step 2, and then the blood vessels penetrate the cartilage and invade the central region and start forming that bone. Step 4, remodeling occurs as growth continues, creating a medullary cavity. That's the cavity where our bone marrow is going to be, and the osseous tissue of the shaft becomes thicker, and the cartilage near the end of the epiphysis is replaced by shafts of bone. Then in step 5, capillaries and osteoblasts migrate into the epiphysis, creating a secondary ossification center. So this was our primary, and now we have a secondary ossification center. So first we had this area that's going to form our diaphysis or our shaft, and now we have this area that's going to form our epiphysis or our head or our heads. All right, so we have these secondary ossification centers, and then the epiphysis eventually becomes filled with spongy bone in our trabeculae, and then the metaphysis, this in between area, is a relatively narrow cartilaginous region called our epiphyseal cartilage or our epiphyseal plate, or sometimes called growth plate, where growth is going to continue. And then at puberty, the rate of epiphyseal cartilage production slows and the rate of osteoblast activity accelerates, and that's where we see that towards the end of puberty, this metaphysis is going to close off. It's not going to have cartilage there anymore, and that's where your growth ends, and we call that epiphyseal closure. Apositional growth, or a compact bone, thickens and strengthens long bone with layers of circumferential lamellae. Epiphyseal lines, when the long bone stops growing after puberty, you have a long bone. A mature long bone is not going to have those growth plates anymore, or that cartilage at the metaphysis. This shows you the cartilage in a child's hand. They still have cartilage in the metaphysis of their phalanges or their finger bones, and then we see that they are closed off. You can't see those growth plates anymore. Intramembranous ossification, also called dermal ossification, because it occurs in the dermis, produces dermal bones such as the mandible and the clavicle. There are 5 main steps in intramembranous ossification. So the other type of ossification is what we typically talk about because it occurs in long bones, and then we also talk about intramembranous ossification that occurs in the dermis. So mesenchymal cells or stem cells cluster together, differentiate into osteoblasts, which are our builders, and start to secrete the organic components of the matrix. The resulting osteoid then becomes mineralized with calcium salts, forming that bone matrix. As ossification proceeds, some osteoblasts are trapped inside bony pockets where they differentiate into osteocytes, which are our mature bone cells, and the development of the bone grows outward from the ossification center in small struts called spicules. Blood vessels begin to branch into regions and grow between the spicules. The rate of bone growth accelerates with oxygen and a reliable supply of nutrients. Then continued deposition of bone by osteoblasts, or builders, located close to the blood vessels, results in a plate of spongy bone with blood vessels weaving throughout it. Then subsequent remodeling around the blood vessels produces osteons, typical of compact bone. So we have our spongy bone form first, and then we have our compact bone. Blood supply of mature bones, nutrient artery and veins are responsible for that. Metaphyseal vessels, and then periosteal vessels as well. So there's a rich supply of nutrients and blood to the bones, opposed to in cartilage where we don't see a lot of vascularity. This shows you how vascular that long bone is. Lymph and nerves, the periosteum, that outer coating, also contains lymphatic vessels and sensory nerves. Process of remodeling, so the adult skeleton, it maintains itself, replaces mineral reserves, recycles and renews blood matrix, and involves the osteocytes, which are adult bone cells, our osteoblasts, those are our builders, and our osteoclasts, so those are our demo crew. Process of remodeling, bone continually remodels, recycles, and replaces. Turnover rate varies. If deposition is greater than removal, then the bones get stronger. All right, if we're depositing more bone than we're removing, it's going to get stronger. If we're removing more than we are depositing, then it's going to get weaker. Effects of exercise. All right, heavy stress on bones, then the bones are going to get thicker and stronger. Bone degeneration. Bone degenerates quickly. Up to 1/3 of bone mass can be lost in a few weeks of inactivity. Normal bone growth and maintenance depend on nutritional and hormonal factors. Okay, so we see in older women, their hormones start to change and their bones aren't as strong. We see in bodybuilders, they are putting a lot of stress on those bones and they're eating a good diet and their bones are very strong. The hormone calcitriol, made in the kidneys, helps absorb calcium and phosphorus from digestive tract. Remember, we need our integumentary system in order to do this because we need that vitamin D3. Vitamin C is required for collagen synthesis, or making collagen, and stimulation of osteoblast differentiation. We need vitamin A, and we need vitamins K and B12. So it's important that you have a good diet, that you have that nutrition, that you're taking in all the vitamins that you need, that you have your D3, you have your C, your A, your K, your B12, so that you have healthy bones. Growth hormone and thyroxine stimulate bone growth. These are our hormonal factors. Estrogens and androgens stimulate osteoblasts, and calcitonin and parathyroid hormone generate calcium and phosphate levels. Skeleton as a calcium reserve. Bones store calcium. Calcium ions in body fluids are regulated, must be closely regulated by the body to maintain homeostasis. The hormone control, all right, these two hormones are going to affect where the calcium is stored, where calcium is absorbed, and where calcium is excreted. So that involves the skeletal system, digestive system, and the urinary system. Parathyroid hormone produced by the parathyroid gland in the neck increases calcium ion levels. Calcitonin secreted by C cells or parafollicular cells in the thyroid decrease calcium ion levels. So these two hormones are helping teeter with the calcium levels in your blood. This is a diagram showing you how these hormones make the body respond to levels of calcium in the body. Fractures, cracks, or breaks in the bones caused by physical stress. Fractures are repaired in 4 steps. First, there's going to be bleeding that's going to occur. Remember that the bones are very vascular, unlike cartilage, and cells of the osteocyte and the endosteum and the periosteum, osteoblasts and osteocytes remodel the fracture for up to a year. Bleeding produces a clot. Cells of the osteum and the periosteum divide and migrate into a fracture zone, and osteoblasts replace the central cartilage of external callus with spongy bone, and the osteoblasts and osteocytes remodel the fracture for up to a year. So it takes a long time to repair that bone. All right, here is a diagram of how you repair a broken bone. Obviously, sometimes it won't be approximated like this or put together still, so doctors will have to reset it. You have closed fractures or simple fractures that stay within the skin, and then you have ones that come out of the skin, which is pretty gruesome. We call those open, or more commonly compound fractures, where it comes out of the skin, and then the doctor has to push it through the skin and then set the bone. Major types of fractures: you have transverse fractures, displaced fractures, compression fractures, all right, which we see in the vertebrae, spiral fractures, epiphyseal fractures at that epiphyseal plate, and we're going to have comminuted fractures, green stick fractures, which is like a hairline fracture, Colles fractures, and then Potts fractures. These are the different fractures. Fractures, compression in the spine, okay, comminuted, green stick like a hairline, and this again shows you how those fractures are going to be repaired. All right, age-related changes: bones become thinner and weaker with age. Osteopenia begins between age 30 and 40. Women lose about 8% of bone mass per decade. Men lose about 3%. The epiphyses and vertebrae and the jaw are most affected, resulting in fragile limbs, a reduction in height, and tooth loss. Osteoporosis, all right, this happens over the age of 45, typically in women, and it affects normal function of the bone, severe bone loss. And this just shows you the difference between a normal spongy bone and then the spongy bone of people with osteoporosis. So a lot of information to take in. Remember, bone is very vascular, cartilage is avascular, and we have our osteocytes, our osteoblasts, and our osteoclasts, and this is all being maintained by our nutrition as well as our hormones. So keep these things in mind as we move forward to next the axial skeleton and then the appendicular skeleton.